Well, let's discuss this now with Analyst Khaya Sithole. Hi there, Khaya. So this is the second AG report into how COVID funds were spent. Let's start with the good news. Some of those relief funds that were sent and given to the wrong people have been clawed back. 3.4 billion rand worth. That surely is a feather in the cap.
Yeah, I think the one great advantage of doing the live audits is that it enables the affected people to identify a trend or a series of transactions that are suspicious or red flag much earlier. And we now know that after the initial report, particularly in relation to the UIF was then able to, well, firstly, there was a suspension of one of its accounting authorities, but also to then start the process of trying to identify the people that have been paid in error. And the fact that 3.4 billion rand has been recovered is obviously a very good start. But I think that was something that was inevitable once the live audits became a thing, because I think the live audits enable the action or the reaction to happen much sooner than what we've seen before. So, of course, people haven't spent the 3.4 billion rand, rather than, for example, finding out 3 or 4 months later or even 10 years later that somebody took an amount of money and then discovering that we cannot recover it anymore.
What was interesting is that the Auditor General found that when it comes to the UIF, that the process has just left too many gaps to be abused. And, you know, it's so interesting because I remember at the time when they were gearing up to make this unusual payment, this COVID relief payment, there was so much discussion about cross-referencing and making absolutely sure that you didn't have an employment, this and that. Clearly, despite all that, the processes still were far too vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think the vulnerability of the UIF's processes was unfortunately made worse by the fact that it had to then onboard people that are not part of its system. And remember, people who had not been contributing to the UIF before the pandemic struck would not have been ordinarily been part of the UIF system. So it was a process of onboarding new beneficiaries and also then trying to pay out the existing claimants. So the system was definitely overburdened, and I do not believe that they actually were ready to be able to deal with the influx. And we now obviously saw the effect of that is that now we do have the reality that far too many transactions went in through the gaps where people were claiming for employees that didn't exist, or people who were deceased, or people who already had other resources. So it is a learning lesson, but I do think that the system is better today than it was back then because of the lessons that they've learned.
Also, the personal protective equipment and other items delivered, there was a lack of consistency about those PPEs were handled as well. And again, that comes down to processes. Is there less of an excuse because these systems should have, to a certain extent, been in place to roll out equipment?
It's a very difficult one because I think what everybody does acknowledge is that when the rollout happened, there were far too many parts of the system, whether at provincial level or at national level, that were not working to begin with, and for them to then have to deal with this emergency situation and probably also handling type of equipment that they were not used to, but this was something that was not going to be easy for anyone to do. But I do think that, of course, you have to be able to say, somebody should have then said, in relation to this particular item or to this particular procurement process, if you do not have the right skills that know how to manage it, the risk is that you may actually end up squandering money. But of course, I think far more importantly here is that it's not just the money that's squandered. If the medication that was ordered, for example, is not handled properly, it either gets wasted or it gets given to a patient who then unfortunately doesn't recover because the medication is no longer fit for purpose. So there's a risk that people actually do lose their lives when these processes are not followed.
I want to move on to another matter, and it's the news that came through to us just a little while ago that the McKinsey consulting firm has now said that it's going to repay the 650 million rand or so that it received from SAA and Transnet for fees that it was paid regarding contracts. It's interesting that the announcement came from the State Capture Inquiry. They apparently initiated a discussion with McKinsey, showed them evidence of likely irregularities, and now McKinsey is going to repay. And of course, McKinsey is due to appear at the Commission tomorrow. Is this a sign of growing accountability, ethical leadership?
No. I don't think we should be accusing McKinsey Consulting of growing ethical leadership. The reality here is that now that the Zondo Commission is spending a bit more focus on the money flows, it becomes very difficult for people to dispute the fact that there was indeed a payment, and then the question is, what is the justification for this payment? And if people cannot back up the justification for the payment, then they need to be able to explain why they received that amount of money. So I think in relation to McKinsey corruption, we've obviously seen them firstly repay the ESCOM amounts, and the SAA and Transnet amounts were something that a lot of people weren't speaking about. But I think a 650 million rand settlement is definitely progress, particularly when a lot of us have been complaining about the costs of the Zondo Commission. So for them, recovering a single cent is an important thing, and 650 is obviously a good step in the right direction.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Analyst Khaya Sithole.